Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. Today we are in beautiful Kalispell, Montana, where we are about to go and get some brain wrinkles right inside this building. Now Kalispell is a historic town that has a lot of really neat things, and I can't wait to share a few of them with you as we go inside this history museum and learn a little bit more. I'm excited, I hope you are. Let's go. The museum itself is located in Central School, which is located on the National Register of Historic Places. This was the first permanent schoolhouse, and it was considered to be and proudly declared nothing decides intellectual status of a town or city as surely as its schools. Which is why this school is so amazing as a museum. It continues the legacy of learning and excellence right here for all of us who visit. So inside these walls, we're about to find Montana history playing out through a series of displays, dioramas, and factual stops. And I can't wait. This one's going to be really great, but this historic building is beautiful and it has landscaped grounds around that allow you to not only have an experience inside, but also outside. As we start off today in the museum, there are a variety of different things I want to bring to your attention before we start the tour. They have some free postcards, some stickers, and also a little pamphlet that is published throughout the year. And this tells you a little bit more about the things that are going on here in the museum. This is accompanied by several different other items in these cases, as well as historic photos from throughout the area. This one was one of my favorites right here. This was from the Woodland Park Pool from 1945. There are several galleries here, and as you walk throughout, you can learn a little bit more about the history. They encourage you to start off in the earliest of days here in the Kalispell area and learn a little bit about Montana history. And so we're going to be going to a gallery just across this hall and starting off. Now, for those who are wanting to visit, I have included the prices here for you so you can see just how much that you need to come prepared with. They do have 2-hour parking that is absolutely free, and I am loving this. This building is beautiful, but the building itself has a pretty cool history as well. At one point in time, of course, it was the school. It turned into a college, and then it turned over to the Historic Society that converted it into this wonderful learning center for us even today. They provide special programs for various times of the year and different kinds of events, including one that I was told about, which is for the third graders, which teaches them about what early school might have been like here in the Kalispell area. They have period clothing that they wear, and they present to them a lot of really cool stuff. And here is just another opportunity for you to kind of dig in and enjoy a bit more of the underlying history of the region. Here we go, the earliest stories from Northwest Montana. Inside this gallery, there is an area that you can actually go inside of the teepee and kind of feel what that would be like. But along the walls and through these cases, we learn the stories, we see some of the tools, and this gallery is unique and unlike many galleries that we have seen previous. See, within this gallery, there are stories that are told by 2 individual men who are from this region, who really got to know the various cultures and Indian people and what all that they had to say, and conveyed their stories through their sculptures, their photography, and by other items where they befriended and really were able to deep dive in a way that many places do not have access to. Now, if you've gone to a museum before, you may have seen artifacts. You may have even seen a card explaining what those artifacts are. But this goes a little bit deeper because we're able to really see the sentiments from each of those people and their personal relationships. And that's what makes this place really neat, because in this gallery, you can see those stories unfold. But I'm going to show you around and let you just kind of see what I'm talking about. Within the state of Montana, several different tribes have called this home. And as a result, you can see on this map the various groupings and how they might have inhabited the different spaces versus where the reservations are in the state as of now. Now, as we know, at one point, everyone free roamed and was able to move about. And through government action, they were moved into these more isolated spaces. Many times these spaces did not have as many of the desired elements as they would need throughout the entirety of the state, and they would compact more than one tribe into a basic postage stamp. So the entirety of the state versus the smaller spaces, which are now the current reservations. The items in this case were provided by Frank Linderman, who was one of those men we were speaking of. He was friends with many of the tribal leaders and was able to earn trust and gain friendship and through that was able to share the stories of how each of these items might have been symbolic, what they were used for, and also he was able to participate in many things that a person of his stature normally would not be welcome to do so. But he considers himself a companion and friend of the tribes. Throughout this display, we also find out more about the elaborate beadwork and trade beads and how they would have used these and how trading as a whole was utilized by the native people and what they were able to gain from this. And this is one of the more interesting displays that I have seen. This shows various trade beads that were made in Italy and France, and they came through the Hudson Bay Company, and you can see each one of the different kinds of beads in addition to those trade beads. And so you have bone beads here, you have delinium shells that were from the Pacific coast, you have pony beads, which were the most common of all, and they were used on garments and horses, and as well as blankets. You can find modern brass beads, which came around from 1890s and going forward. Seed beads, which are these tiny little size double zeros. You also have this one, which was from around the 1860s to the present. This is a 01, which was common on all garments, and you can see it's just a tiny little speck. And then they have garment beads, which are French, and they have a red center, they have red pastels. You can see the variations in colors, and each one of the colors was used to construct elaborate items, such as all of these in this case. Different colors symbolize different things. Different shapes, different styles, different designs, all had different meanings. And still to this day, they are used to convey stories and express joys, tribal rituals, and things like that. And being able to see the variations in the beads all in one case is really, really neat, because you can see what beads that they had, what beads they traded for, where those beads came from, how they made the beads, and then also what else that might have entailed when it comes to the pieces that they would create. And I think that is a small but mighty display that really puts into perspective for a regular everyday person coming in off the street to a museum, a little bit more of the messaging that actually goes into the hard work behind each of these handmade items. None of these beads are being mass produced and then put on with a sewing machine. These are being put on by hand. It's a tedious task. And we get this different look and perspective into that, and I think that's incredible. But this is only one display in a room full of displays. So I'm going to touch on a few of these, but I do encourage you to come here because I think you're going to see the layers here are so special. This. I've never seen this at a different museum that I've been to. Not a single museum has had something like this. This is when en route to the Pacific Ocean in 1805, Lewis and Clark came upon something that they had never seen before, and they were puzzled. It was this. They were traveling with Sacagawea, as we know her, and she explained to the men that her people, the Shoshone, would peel off the inner bark of certain trees, and it was sweet, and it also was enriched with nutrients. And some of the most sought after bark came from the western yellow pine, the lodgepole pine, the white pine, and the quaking aspen. And they would take that innermost layer of the bark, and it was the most desired, and the tree sap was more fluid and was less sticky in the spring. So that was the best time to collect this. Now, this is actually pretty common practice, but it's centered around Idaho and Montana specifically. And so when they saw this, they'd never seen it. So they were just like, why? But why? Why would they do that? And so she continued on and explained to them the benefits of why they would do this bark peeling. Believe it or not, this was like the earliest of chewing gums. Now, this was considered to be sweet, like a little sweet treat. And the practice died off whenever refined sugars started to come into the picture and replace that. And so around the 20th century, they were no longer peeling bark and using it as like a sugary sweet something. And I thought that was kind of interesting because that is a very wild story that I've never heard before, and at the same time was something so fascinating how once again the tribes would be able to use things in a resourceful way. Now, as we've learned at many museums previous, every single place that you would go, if they were hunting, if they were gathering, they would use every single piece. They would find medicinal purposes with plants. They would plant plants accordingly so that they could treat things or be able to use them for variations, not just for food purposes. But I thought this was really neat because this was something that was already there that they had discovered they could use, and it turned into something that is a more commonly known item that we still enjoy today. Inside the teepee, you can find what teepee life would have been like as you go into the space, and you can see furs which would line the floor to keep it warm and make it a little bit more comfortable. You can see where they would have a fire in the middle and it would vent out through the top, through basically like a stack. Now in this particular teepee, they do have it where they can have kiddos come in here and do stories so that they can learn about history. So it's a little bit more convenient. They have lights so that you can see it a bit better. And then they have this, which typically plays music and lets you hear the Indigenous voices. I think that this is a great interactive exhibit for kiddos to learn a little bit more. They can touch the texture of the tent to feel what the canvas might have felt like. They can see the sheer height and size, and they can learn about why patterns were painted in some cases and in other cases not. But there's additional signage here for us adults who might not want to crawl inside, and it mentions that this is a 16-foot replica of a traditional Sioux teepee. So as you travel from place to place, teepees will vary from the poles that they use to the material on the outside. Now, at some points, people would use tanned skins to make their outer teepee cover. Later on, canvas became more popular when trade routes began to really thrive and boom. But here you can see it firsthand and get an idea what it really would have been like. This headdress is from the Blackfeet people. It's made of 25 eagle feathers, and also it has 25 ermine tails on it. Behind this glass, it's a little bit of a glare, but we can see some of the various items that are inside here. And we learned that very few artifacts actually survived from the time before the traders began to settle the area. And trade brought back a lasting communication, conversation, and also collection of items that are seen more commonly today. This is where we insert Frank Linderman once again. He was able to record the stories of the people that he met. He was able to ask them questions about what each thing meant. And because of that guard that many of the cultures had to the white man, we weren't previously aware of many of these things. And so by him sharing the ways that he was taught and he learned by hand in person, he was able to convey to us many of the stories that we are able to pass on in today's museums. And he's also formed a line of communication that instills a little bit more trust and understanding with the tribes today. I think that we all know that some of the things that happened wouldn't give you the most trust if it was you. And so it's hard to bridge that gap once again and take something that is sacred and important and make it public. And so by these displays, we are able to have a glimpse into a window of an otherwise somewhat private group of people and see how that they have been impacted, how that they have thrived and survived, how that they have passed down traditions, and how that even to this day, there are tribes around the country who still celebrate and honor these traditions. And I think that by getting this little window inside, we are given a great commodity that otherwise we are not necessarily entitled to. And so this is a special place. It's a special place where we get to share in something that is super special. And so when you come here, I think that you'll understand that by the signs that are here. Now, I'm just telling some of the stories again, but make sure you take time with each of these. There's so much great information here. For example, how that they would prepare a hide by fleshing it out with tools, de-hairing the skin, and how they would use bladed tools that were made of bone. And then they would use every single piece of the bison. Every single piece had some form of ability to do something to help the tribe, from the hide that they used and tanned to the brain that they used to tan that hide and everything in between. They made ladles, they made things to hunt with. They made things to keep warm. They created their teepees. They created other things. And the bison was one of the biggest assets to the tribal people. Of course, we learned after people started figuring out that that was a big asset, that they tried to eradicate the bison to make it harder for them to survive and thrive. But here, instead of talking about that, we celebrate the people themselves. And through this display, we're able to see a look into those people in a unique way. And it's just so fascinating and, so enthralling to see this and be able to read their stories, But in addition to their stories, we get to learn about Frank Linderman, who survived the wilderness and lived amongst the Flathead Indians. And as he recorded his findings, he was able to share quotes. He was able to talk about the chiefs that he had met, like Little Bear, which was the chief of the Crees. He worked closely with Little Bear and established permanent home for his people, which was accomplished in 1916 with the establishment of Rocky Boys Reservation. He was able to bridge the gap between the not-so-nice government and the people and gain trust. And he published title upon title to explain his findings and to give insight as to these amazing people in a way that wasn't necessarily exploiting them, but rather uplifting them. And along the way, you get to learn more about what he found out through each of these sections. Now, as we speak a little bit more about Frank, he was born in Ohio in 1869, and he came west at the age of only 16, and he ended up in the Swan Valley, and he was a trapper and a trader. You can see here, this is a cabin that he built with his friend and his future brother-in-law, Sam Johns, in 1889. And throughout this time, you can see various points of his life and what led him to the place where he was in this region and also was active with the native people. In fact, you can see here, he was even in the legislature at one point. In fact, as a member of the legislature, that only bridged his gap even more because he wanted to work with the people as opposed to against the people. And that's what brought him in closer contact with each of the tribal leaders. And he really worked through some interesting things with them as a result of being in that office. He wanted to provide a fair understanding of not only them, but also of how they could proceed forward as a state and live in harmony with one another. And in Kalispell, you can see a variety of different items that really bring into perspective what Kalispell was and where it began. Here you can find an early map of Kalispell in 1911, along with some historic photos. You can see where everything was, how the streets were laid out. There's lots of details here. And through looking at this, you can take this map, and if you've been through Kalispell proper now, you can envision where things are and what that once looked like. Around this room, you will find historic photo after historic photo. You will find sign after sign, bringing you to the full context of where Kalispell started, where it advanced, and then also what the purpose of each section of Kalispell happened to be. In fact, in 1891, James J. Hill faced a dilemma, and after a years-long search, Hill's team had finally located the Marias Pass, and he provided a route for the Great Northern Railway to enter the American West. And guess what? It was right here in Flathead Valley, and it was Kalispell that was the selected region. Within only 1 year of that determination, everything had changed, and so many people flooded into this area. And in doing so, the city rose quickly. And with that, the infrastructure the town needed started to fall into place, and everything really started to boom here in the city. Now, there's a variety of different things in here that I think are just really neat. I'm going to show you some of the different artifacts from the past, and then we'll move into what is this? As we move into this section, it says the railroad employee James M. Montgomery and his wife Esther lived and raised their 6 children in the depot upstairs apartment from 1913 to 1940. So you guessed it, this is the depot. And you can find here several small pieces that indicate where the Great Northern Railway would have moved, not only here in Kalispell, but in other places. Additionally, along these walls, you'll find newspaper clippings of very interesting things, such as the dead witness at the Opera House, some of the classified listings that you can find: a feed store wood yard, a 36-room hotel, 160-acre timber, and 640 acres of stumpland, souvenir playing cards, a lost and found. Even a boat schedule and special rates are on here. Now, this is a huge model. It is basically half of the room. It gives you kind of an idea as to what the residence would have looked like, as well as the functional space. There is a map here as well that gives you a map of Montana and the various regions and water stations that were located along this map. As you move around to this side, it shows you what the loading dock and also like the lumber would have been at this region, and it was one of the first products that was actually sent out in a freight car. In the corner, we find out about what the druggist might have been doing at the drugstores. It gives a little description here of what an early druggist job might have looked like, what the pharmacy would have been established to do, and also why that would have been so important for a community like this. But inside these cabinets, you can find a variety of different items that might have been associated with the druggist. And followed by that, you have a little bit more information about the mercantiles and the hardware stores. And within each of these signs, it tells you about each of the different establishments, who owned it, when it was established, what that they did, and then a historic photo. I think that this is a great way to connect with each individual item, but then also down below, you can take a hands-on approach to these catalogs, which were used in the Kalispell Mercantile. They were considered to be the early department stores, and you could buy just about everything in them. They also have this really epic time capsule that they will be opening in 2049, and I can only imagine it is filled full of really unique things. I am excited. Will I be here in 2049? Who knows? The walls and windows are surrounded by history, and here you walk in and you're just immediately surrounded by the faces of those who lived in this area, the processions, the buildings, and there's even a couple of eagles in here. This was from the Eagle Shoe Company, and it was one of Kalispell's various shops that they had. And the Eagle Shoe Company actually spans generations like no other. And it had two founders, and it had a lasting identity based on this image right here. Now, in 1892, on a cold winter day, a trapper who had been camping on the bank of the Flathead River wandered into the store, and he was desperate for a new pair of boots that could brave the conditions. And he didn't have any money, but he was in possession of two eagles. This one and this one. And he was able to make a trade, and they were able to, in fact, use these, and they have been with the company or in the museum ever since. That store closed in the 70s, and these were so symbolic to the area that they had to be taken care of and preserved. And so they were brought to a place that everyone could still see them and enjoy them and hear their story. And I think that it's pretty incredible that a community that was based on the hard work of others and the backbreaking work that sometimes happened was able to see the necessity in an item and see the beauty in something that is so important to our country, and bring those two things together and create this symbol of just absolute necessity and joy. Now, for the younger crowd, you probably have never seen these. I still remember these from shoe stores. They don't use them as much now, but they still do have them. But in this corner, you can try on a variety of shoes, and you can see how In the past, at these shoe stores, someone would fit you for a pair of shoes, and you would sit down and you would use a bench like this, and then you could use a mirror like this and check out, do I like these? Ooh, those look good. But in addition to the shoe store and its incredible story, you can find some other really incredible pictures here. This is a little different. This is outside Robin and Robin clothing store. It was located at 212 Main Street in 1942, and there was a story that was told of a dead timber wolf that was found near Swan Lake, and the timber wolf was then on display at Big Fork and Kalispell, and it included a display at the Robin and Robin clothing store. Now, this was the timber wolf. It weighed 131 pounds and it measured 82 inches from tip to tip. And the Smithsonian sent Walter Robin a letter verifying at the time that it was considered the largest one in the world. You never know what you're going to find. You're looking at a beautiful display about clothing and the different shops and learning about each one of them, and then you find a world record timber wolf. Now, in this corner, a familiar favorite for myself, this is the newspaper section. It shows you the printing press, the typeset, and how that they might have put together the newspaper, but also the birth of the Kalispell newspaper, not in Kalispell. And I think that is kind of interesting. In fact, as of most of the rest of the story of the community, the Interlake newspaper began its life in a different community. Remember how we talked about a lot of people just moved into Kalispell because this became the hub with the train? Well, this was the case with the newspaper too. They already had an established newspaper, but that town was dwindling because people were moving and they needed the news here. And so they uprooted and moved to this very city. And in doing so, they started producing the newspaper in this area as opposed to somewhere else. So even though it was the Kalispell newspaper, which was interesting because it was mostly Kalispell news, it wasn't always that. It was a regional newspaper more so than anything, and that's the best way to look at it. Now, print is a dying form, so anytime I get to see these things, it makes me so happy. You can still smell the ink from some of these typeset pieces, and it has a very specific smell to it. And whenever you go into a print shop and you smell that smell, it just brings you to a moment, if you've ever worked in newspaper, that is so unique. And so I geek out when I see this. But along with this, there's also a video and photographs in this area that are worth the shot of just taking your time and looking at. In this section, we learn about theaters, and this piece of equipment right here is a part of the theater and production area, and you can see it is really neat. I love seeing older equipment like this because you just don't see things like this very frequently, even at museums. And so whenever you do get to see one that's in this good of a condition, it's just impressive to be able to look inside, see the inner workings, look at the lens, see where the reels would have been. When it comes to theaters though, a rush on playhouses occurred between 1907 and 1911, and amongst these were the Oriental Theatorium, the Empire Family Theater, and then the Ophirium, the Lyric, and the Bijou. And the operator of the first ones of these was Professor W.F. Zimmerman, and he was a music instructor who had offices in the Opera House. Now, after learning about all of the different businesses in the Kalispell room, we're going upstairs to find out a little bit more. And in every direction, you find something a little unique, including this guy. This is basically a little weasel, and he's commonly found in the Northwest and in Canada. And with this view, you have a wood duck. And it's a summer inhabitant of this region, and it spends winters in Mexico and Cuba. There is an elevator, but there's also stairs. And as we go up these stairs, we see even more critters. Oh, wow. As we make it up the stairs, there are a series of other things in addition to the bear that we just saw. Lewis Hill and the Great Northern Railway. It says Lewis Hill assumed the presidency of the Great Northern in 1907. And when the park was established in 1910, its boundary ran along the Great Northern's right-of-way. And in December 1911, Hill retired as president, and he did so that he could focus on the park, which is Glacier. And I think that it is incredible that he had tied to this area, but then he found this area to be so desirable that he wanted to protect and preserve the park itself. That is so neat. I feel like I've talked to a lot of people in this region, and because of the harsh conditions and the weather, a lot of people say, if you are here, it's here because you want to be here. You want to be a part of this community. And because of that, the community comes together to really support its own self and the park and all of the natural spaces. And I think that that is amazing. And I think that's why whenever we move into this gallery, which is called the Land of Many Stories, it really is echoed through the different signage. And I am very excited to learn more. This, for example, here you have a waitress on the main veranda of the Going to the Sun Chalet in 1933, and it's accompanied by the Granite Park Chalet in 1939, and women camping at Two Medicine Campground in 1932. These images are tied to the fact that there are so many who have contributed to this park system. And it says here that Hill's first campaign was See America First. And it was his goal to keep people local as opposed to wanting to go abroad or to other places. And he coined the term that this was the American Alps and that you could come here and have this unique experience. And it was set up with these wonderful chalets and glorious fields, which really were inviting. And tourism was promoted through literature and advertising. And the more that people started to get a glimpse at this beautiful place, the more that people started to realize just why this was such a special spot, not just for the locals, but for everyone. And now Glacier is one of the most coveted parks to visit. In fact, it's so coveted that you have to get a park pass for timestamps to come to various points. And I think it's incredible. I got to go just get a glimpse of it. And it was just like every single view was amazing. So yeah, let's read more. This bear right here is one of two kinds of bears that you will find in the park. This is a grizzly bear. Now, grizzly bears are huge. They are much larger than a black bear. Grizzly bears are also much more dangerous. Their teeth are bigger. Their claws are bigger. They can stand up and tower over a grown man easily. So grizzly bears, if you see one, you're looking for this head shape. You're looking for this foot shape with these outstandingly long claws. Around this corner, we learn about the Going to the Sun Road, and it's nearly impossible to look up at Glacier's Going to the Sun Highway with anything less than awe. And here you can see the painstaking work it took to create this incredible roadway. This was not a simple act. It was not just a paver going out there and just creating a road. In fact, it was near impossible. They had to shear cliffs. They had short summers. There were 20-yard snow drifts in some times, and they needed this to be able to connect one point to the next. And Glacier National Park finally was able to celebrate this after they were able to complete it in 1933. And today, this is the most coveted passage to be able to visit in the entirety of the park, but it started out just looking really rough and rugged. How rugged was it, though? Well, teams would sometimes have to climb up 3,000 feet just to survey it so that they could start to make it possible. And then they had all of the limitations when it came to what was available. It was harder to get goods and services because the area was primarily covered in snow about half of the year. They were able to move things in with heavy equipment, but they would have random weather that would come in and make it near impossible to work. And as they continued to move forward, all they wanted to do was get this road finished. And it was one of the more complicated tasks in all the national park system to make happen. But eventually it was completed. And in doing so, wow, the views are incredible. All that work took 20 years to complete. That is insane. But now it proves to be the biggest resource and asset of Glacier. And in doing so, they're able to tell stories of the terrain, the people, and the land, and show you beautiful views of just why people thought that Montana was something that people needed to come and see. And all that work culminated at a ceremony of about 4,000 people who turned up to welcome everyone to go to the sun. We have a North American beaver here, and those are pretty common in the park. Going along this row, we have lake trout and bull trout and lake whitefish and brook trout and cutthroat trout and graylings and rainbow trout. And all of these can also be found in this region of Montana. This door is closed, but it says we can go in. And it shows that it is a hall that is climate controlled with a big display room. They also do some lectures and instruction in here, but I was told that this was the thing that I definitely needed to check out in this room, and I can see why this is incredible. But getting back to what is actually on the walls, you have a series of postcards that are greetings from Demersville, which was where everyone came to Kalispell from. Now, this was the first real city, but when the railroad came in, this was basically replaced as the metropolis of Kalispell. It even mentions, you won't be able to find it on a modern map, but it was the heart of settlement in the early Flathead Valley. And today's Montana Flathead Valley is widely acknowledged as one of the last best places in the United States or even the world. You walk around the walls, you learn who founded Demersville. You find why it was important, why it was selected, why it was chosen, and what happened. You can find the rise and fall of the community, and you can see approximately where it was located on the map in comparison to Kalispell proper now. You learn about John Clifford, who was the only mayor that ever existed in the community. The first, the last, the best, the worst. He was everything. And he was a good businessman, but he let his worst tendencies get the better of him. And in doing so, he was considered to be questionable sometimes. He was involved in almost every aspect of the town, like almost everyone. He was a business owner who was dabbling in all the businesses. He had the mayor's seat. He basically controlled it. And some people said he was a little power hungry. Other people said he was the nicest man on earth. But along the way, of course, we know the story. Demersville dimmed. And whenever it did, well, the sidewalks basically rolled up and this man became the first, last, best, and worst. Here we learned that despite being one of the younger settlements in the Flathead Valley, it was considered to be the first to actually incorporate. And it did that in 1891. And that was only 4 short years after the first trading post even opened in that area. And at the time of its incorporation, it was around 1,500 people. Now, in its heyday, it had up to 73 liquor licenses, but it also had a racetrack and a church and other businesses. So why exactly would a town that had that much going on suddenly be non-existent? Well, that's the power of the railroad. There are many things throughout history that we have learned that have made towns rise and fall. Some of those have included the mining industry, others have included the railroad. Both of those things were said to make booms and busts. And if you were not along one of those transport lines, you were basically left out into the cold. And because Kalispell was just a short distance away from this community, it just simply didn't make sense. It wasn't like the suburban areas that we have today where people would thrive in a suburban that would pop up and have all these cool things. It wasn't like the suburbs of today where you have a Starbucks and a Walmart and a Lowe's and a Home Depot and a restaurant and another restaurant and another restaurant and another restaurant. It wasn't like that. Typically, you didn't need all of those businesses and then have another community with all of those businesses like right next door. It just wasn't like that. There weren't metropolises back then. So the necessity would move to where the necessity was for shipping, goods, services, deliveries, mail, things like that. And so that is why Demersville started to fade as the railroad moved in. As we closed the door and we moved back out to the main area, now we have the full story of what happened with not only Kalispell, but Demersville. And we now know why things happened the way that they did. Along the way, we also see more historic photos, including this one, which is on the Going to the Sun Highway. That's snow, guys. That's why the road is not always accessible. In fact, you can see here, this is the Speary Glacier in 1920, which is Glacier's namesake. They were known for the ginormous glaciers that would sit up on top of the mountains and the weather patterns that those would create throughout the year. But something else that Glacier has been known for, and still to this day they have, is something called the Red Buses. In 1915, Lewis Hill signed an agreement with Walter White to provide transportation services to Glacier. This was for a few reasons. Transportation in an individual vehicle would have been a bit harder in some of the areas, and so they knew the paths, they knew where they were going, and they could take tours and show you where everything was in a safer way. And so all of this began as a result of a 1915 agreement that still to this day, again, is echoed in the park. Over time, a lot of things have changed, but one thing that remains consistent is the look of those buses, and they still provide those tours. So even though contracts have changed, they've been upgraded and things like that, from old models to new models, they're still very similar. So if you ride in one of these, you have a very reminiscent experience to the experience that could have been had all the way back in the earliest of 1900s. And I think that is such a unique thing that you only find at, to my knowledge, 2 parks. Of course, there are also other critters here, including mountain lions and coyotes. And here you can learn more about those, so you can find out what they look like, what they look for, what they eat. And then along each of these cases, you find more of the birds and find out some tips for bird watching in the park. Glacier is considered to be an adventure seeker's paradise. There's something around every corner. You can get in the water, you can climb mountains, you can do rock climbing, you can take scenic drives, you can do fishing, kayaking, boating, tours. You can go and check out the animals. There are so many things, and for a person who craves wilderness adventures, Glacier is one of the most coveted parks to visit. It's been on my bucket list for a long time, and finally making it here, I felt like just like this moment, and so I think you would as well. Now, there's something else that I do want to share with you though. We've gone through the park, we've learned about the town history, but there's a really neat way that you can connect even more deeply, and they have signs for it here in the museum. They have walking tours, and you can scan the QR code to find out a little bit more information, but they are in conjunction with the museum. It takes you through downtown Kalispell from June to September. They give you a full history of the area. They tell you the stories, some of the behind the scenes things that you might not know just looking at the buildings, and I definitely encourage you to check this out. I think that this is something that if you're wanting to spend some time in the Kalispell area and fully have context, this is a must. But now we go into the Flathead Valley history, and as we go through this section, there is a series of different items that we can interact with, we can read about, and we can proceed forward in a counterclockwise fashion. Kind of talks about the summary of the Flathead Valley as a whole, the people who are here, what you can see, what kind of nature is abundant, and then also they have some really great interactive things. I think this section is the most interactive for the kiddos, so let's go see what we can touch and play with. The first interactive element is this one, which has the titles Nature and Beauty, Soil and Climate, Wildlife, Forests, Rivers, and Lakes. There are a series of questions here, and you are supposed to guess which one of these topics addresses the question. So, for example, was used by Indians and other early settlers for transportation into the Flathead Valley. Which one do you think it is? I personally think that it's going to be rivers and lakes. Let's see. Am I correct? I am. So then it tells you more information about the rivers and lakes of this area and how that they were used by the indigenous people with the birch bark canoes, and then also by steamboats in the 1880s. Now there is also an Our Heritage video where you can play each chapter or you can play all. And in order to do that, you just push the button and then sit back and watch a little bit of fun. Now, after going through the video in each of the chapters where you get to see historic context, you can come back to this section and check out each of these regions, which talks about the land apart, how we got there, the stagecoaches versus mud wagons, the iron horses and steamboats, and then also the great northern changes, the valley. So what this talks about is from the Native American people, the Indian people who were here, how they would get around and how they would do things, to whenever we started making slow advancements toward the ultimate stop, which is the railroad, how that shaped the Flathead Valley as a whole. Attached to this is also a timeline of all of the different steps where you can see the original trek with horses and how they went over the Rockies and how they would hunt bison, and then how the Washington Territorial Government, Isaac Stevens, negotiated with the tribes to establish a joint reservation. And then it brings you all the way to 2010, where the population for Flathead County as a whole is 91,000 people. Between 1800 and 2010, a lot of things happened, as you can see, and reading each and every one of those steps and then kind of corresponding with the stages below is absolutely fascinating to see how this once kind of rugged terrain with very few people is now a booming area that hosts a lot of jobs. It has tons of different recreating people come here for fun. It has so many different historic things, and this museum echoes each and every one of those steps in such a unique way. But as we move to the corner over here, we're going to learn more about the steamboats and the passage boats and the tugboats and how that they were used in this region, and why that also changed the landscape of how we perceive movement in this region, from the most primitive ways to the most productive ways. Before trains, all of these things were the ways that they would move passengers from Polson to Summers. They would move freight. They would have excursions for recreation. And they would actually have things like this paddle wheel right here, which was the Crescent, built in 1891 in Columbia Falls. And it was a stern wheel steamboat that had a big old paddle in the back. It was 110 feet long and could carry passengers and freight from Columbia Falls to Polson. Now, yesterday when I was driving around with my friends Charles and Tony, they took me on this giant loop and we went to Columbia Falls and we went to Polson, and we were able to do that in a car and drive it because the roadway and infrastructure is now here. However, it wasn't always that, and cars were much different. They were slower. The ruggedness of the terrain made it very difficult to get from point A to point B, so these boats were the way to do it. And I found it to be very interesting after having that tour and just kind of looking at the community and how it links together, as to how at previous points in history that wasn't always the case. And so seeing how that they were able to navigate through these like treacherous areas at the time, very fascinating. Here we are encouraged to walk on board this boat and learn a little bit more about a water tank and piston. It says water plus heat equals steam, plus pistons plus paddle wheel equals propulsion. And this is how that they would move, is using something like this. Now, centuries later, there are replicas to commemorate various attempts at different things. Now, the story here is in 1892, they attempted an ill-fated voyage. They were supposed to go up the North Fork of the Flathead River out of Columbia Falls. And along the way, they had commissioned a boat, which was 75 foot long, and it was called the Oaks. They were hoping to access the coal fields at the Canadian border, and they were going to make a killing doing it because they were going to sell all the coal to the railroad. But the wild river decided that that was not going to happen for them, and they actually floundered only a few miles away and had to abandon ship. So in this area, you see relics of that wreck, things that happened that didn't quite go to plan. And you can see they're pretty beat up, they're pretty weathered and worn. And then along the way, you can also see what the boats might have looked like on the walls around. In fact, this is a recreation of the Oaks. It was pretty simple. It was a bare bones boat. They were hoping just to be able to bring lots and lots of cargo on board and take it. And so they didn't need something that was super elaborate like all the passenger boats. It was more of a cargo ship that didn't need a lot of extras. It didn't need all the fine frills. And a pioneer who actually wanted to really make a difference commissioned this to be built just for this project. And he had a crew, and they were sailing the ship up the falls, and then it just went bad. See, depending on the time of year that you decide that you want to go into the waters, to go even rafting today, you may have very turbulent waters, you may have very high waters, or you may have very low, calm waters. You never know until you get in there. And once you get in there, you're in it, you're committed, you must go. And so that was probably what happened with this. They probably just picked the wrong time to launch. They probably hit the wrong rapid or rock. And that was the end of the story. Now, when it comes to transportation, eventually roadways started to be built that would cross over these waters. And in 1894, the very first bridge was crossing over the Flathead River. It was a 600-foot spanning bridge, and it had steel overhead trusses and timber. And here you can see how that was constructed. Now, along this old steel bridge, they were able to use it for many things. And there are photos of the old steel bridge even after it was completed. And as we go up, you can see it in these reflective pieces also. Being able to bridge those waterways truly made it easier for them to be able to navigate by something other than a boat. And so that's whenever you started to see more and more roadways starting to complete the trek from point A to point B. And in doing so, it made it a bit easier for people to more regularly recreate and or just drive and commute. And so throughout time, as time continued to advance, more of these bridges were put into place, roadways were improved slightly, and as that continued, we get closer and closer to where we are today, where you can take a car and you can make it from one point to the next in the matter of less than a day and have a really great time doing it while you're seeing all of the beauty and the views. Which brings us to recreation. Recreation became more and more popular in this area as navigating through this region became easier. And so you find more of the movie houses, more people outdoor recreating. You find people who are skiing in this area and being able to take advantage of the terrain itself. In fact, it was the early 1930s whenever Hardy Valley skiers made their first 2-mile winter trip up the mountains, and they were able to ski back down. So by the 30s, they were really starting to push into the recreational side of the beautiful surrounding areas. We find a really incredible map of the Flathead Lake area, and this is the U.S.'s natural freshwater largest lake west of the Mississippi. It's over 27 miles long. It's up to 15 and a half miles wide, and the average depth is 165 feet. Now, this has been super important for this community, and it has allowed many things to happen. And along this series, you can find out what some of those stories are and what has made all of these really impactful moments happen as a result of this lake, including agriculture. In fact, there's an entire section in this room about the agriculture in the area. And during the 1890s, the population of the valley surged, and flour mills and breweries and creameries and butcher shops and other farm-related businesses all began to be established at a really rapid rate. And because of the railroad access, that meant that there were steam-powered machines and heavy farm equipment which were able to be delivered, which really helped the process for each of these farmers and made it a bit easier. By the early 1900s, there were over 700 farms in this area. Many of those farms relied heavily on the lake system and the rivers to irrigate their crops and to make sure that they had plenty of water so things could thrive. Now, in this area, I've been very excited to learn that huckleberries are literally everywhere. They have cherries that are synonymously known for this region, but those aren't the other things. There are so many things that are grown in this region even to this day. Not to mention there are lots of people who have ranches with horses and cattle and other livestock that thrive in these communities. Now, another cool fact that I learned was that in this region, they use a lot of these water supplies to supply electricity to communities through hydropower, through the dam systems. And so by doing that, they provide much of the Flathead Valley area with electricity through the dams. So the waterways have been instrumental in moving things throughout time. They have been instrumental in growing things throughout time and also providing for the communities throughout time. Hey guys, that's gonna do it for us here at the museum. I got my patch. I'm gonna stick this in my van. If you are in Kalispell, this is a must-see stop. It is very affordable. It is a wonderful way to set some context. They have maps. They have great feedback for other things that you can do in the region. And this is an amazing place just to get some brain wrinkles. I love whenever I can come to a place and see not only what I am physically seeing in front of me, but what might have been here before. It tells me a bigger story as to why the community has the things that it does, but also the people, why that they are so committed to the community that they are in. Because you never know. We can always learn from the past to make better tomorrows, but today's adventure path was definitely one of the best stops that I have made in a bit, not only for the location, but also for the people inside. Remember guys, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time. I'll see you later. Bye. This place was epic.